You people going to the Jkia where planes are landing and trying to sleep there when you know that a plane may land at any time. NCIC, the National Commission on Integration Commission, is a toothless dog that bites but has no capacity of biting. Dialogue comes in different forms. Demonstrating is one way of dialogue. Why Gen Zs are running away from dialogue is because the opposition want to hijack the protests and force the president into a corner to dialogue with the view of sharing power. People did not go to the streets so that Raila Odinga can sit with President Ruto and share power. People went to the streets because they felt that the government was giving them a raw deal. The president never called for any demonstrations and he cannot stop any demonstrations. Him is to watch, provide security and ensure that protesters are protected, ensure that people's property is protected and that criminals, looters are isolated, arrested so that peaceful demonstrations can go on in the country.
So Kenyans have been protesting for the better part of the past 2 months, and we just wanted to know, we understand that there are areas that are legally protected, some are designated areas. For example, when tomorrow people want to demonstrate at the JKIA airport, are there specific areas that are designated as protesting areas and others are not?
Thank you very much. To understand this, to explain this question, I must first give you the background and tell you that in this country we have an act of parliament called the Judicature Act, and this is an act that gives us the hierarchy of laws and how laws should be given the priority in terms of respect. And at the apex is our constitution. The Constitution of Kenya 2010 is the senior most legal document of reference in this country. Under our constitution, the law provides that every person has a right to demonstrate, picket and present public petitions to any authority, and that is the supreme law of the land. We have another law called the Public Order Act. Public Order Act is an act of parliament, and every law must be understood in context. Public Order Act was actually an act that was conceived with the colonial mentality of restricting demonstrations, of restricting picketing. Before the Constitution, the entire Public Order Act ought to be declared unconstitutional because it defeats every purpose, intent, and spirit of our Constitution, which is largely progressive in our region. Secondly, we have another piece of legislation called the Restricted Areas Act. The Restricted Areas Act outlines areas that the public is restricted from accessing. Again, this is another retrogressive law that was passed with a colonial mindset that because we were Africans and of a lesser race, we could not access specific regions for the security and peace of the occupants, who were largely colonialists. Such area was State House. Such areas are the police barracks. What in a legal mindset should be restricted is the use of force and the use of extralegal means in accessing these areas. If you are to apply the Public Order Act strictly and the Restricted Areas Act strictly, it will defeat the purpose of the Constitution, which allows every person to present public petitions to any authority, so long as they are unarmed and they are peaceful. Tell me, how do you present your public petition to the president and the head of state who resides at State House if they are restricting State House? To the extent that the Public Order Act and the Restricted Areas Act prohibits peaceful and unarmed protesters from accessing critical areas to present either public petition or their public grievances, those are unconstitutional provisions. And remember, every person has a duty to protect the Constitution, protect, uphold, and promote the Constitution. If you succumb to acts of parliament that were enacted with a colonial mindset, you lose the purpose of the Constitution. And therefore, to that extent, there is no area in this country constitutionally that has been restricted and that the public cannot access for whatever reasons, provided the tenets of peaceful and unarmed demonstrations are exercised under our constitution.
To my second question, is it illegal now to have protests in the areas, because it's still in the constitution? Is it illegal for protesters to occupy some areas designated as per now as restricted areas, critical infrastructure, or protected areas? And what are the do's and don'ts and consequences of that?
You know, when we are being told that the areas are restricted areas under the Act, who are restricted from going there? The general public, specific public. We do not have anything that bars an individual from picketing, demonstrating, and presenting public petitions in any area, provided the test in whatever protest, the test is that you must be peaceful, you must be unarmed, and you must protect property. That is the only constitutional test that has been put on the protesters. These are the things that these areas are restricted. That is theoretical, and it is theoretically illegal. But be it the government that we know, what happens is that if you then access the so-called restricted area, what the police ought to do is to arrest you and charge you under the Restricted Areas Act on the Public Order Act, the violation of those acts. Once you have been charged with those acts, your lawyer should then argue that you have been charged under laws that are unconstitutional ab initio, and then you get an acquittal. Yeah.
So there are no proper consequences for trespassing right
The
now?
proper consequences for trespassing, the very worst that can happen is that the police will arrest you and they ought to arraign you within 24 hours before a court of competent jurisdiction, and you are tried. And the first call of recourse for any constitutional lawyer is to challenge the legality of those charges. You cannot prevent the citizenry from accessing specific areas. Remember, the first article of the Constitution is sovereign power belongs to the people. It is with the people. Yeah.
And in the event that we protest at a place like Jkia, we're stopping transportation, we're stopping some things from taking place. Is that illegal, or as long as we're peaceful, that can still happen?
You see, even for your own security as protesters, I don't see the possibility of you people going to the Jkia where planes are landing and trying to sleep there when you know that a plane may land at any time. That alone is endangering your lives. But there is nothing wrong with protesters walking to JKIA offices, the JKIA precincts, without interfering with the normal operations of the airport to protest. It only becomes wrong when you interfere with the general operations of JKIA or general operations of the court. You can come to these courts and protest if you think that the magistrates and the lawyers are not doing adequately what they are called to do. You can protest, but you may not go and force a magistrate and an advocate and litigants out of court and interfere with the functioning of the court. Provided that in the protests you are peaceful, you are not armed, you are not destroying property, you are not interfering with the general running of JKIA, such protests remain lawful.
All right. And just as a citizen of this country, you have seen the Gen Z protest.
Yes.
Do you think at this point that they should embrace dialogue, or should they keep on with the protests?
You know, I am a teacher of language and an advocate. Even demonstrations are forms of dialogue. You know, dialogue comes in different forms. Demonstrating is one way of dialogue. Because if the government cannot understand the language of signs, you attempt the language of symbols. And then when you are calling Gen Zs to dialogue, what is this that the president wants to dialogue with them? What is this that the president does not understand from the things that Gen Z has presented, from their wish list? What is this that he cannot understand? If it's a question of corruption, do you require a general national convention to discuss measures against corruption? You don't. If it is about the cost of living, do you require young children to come and sit with you, discuss how to lower cost of living? You don't. If it is about effectiveness of his government, he doesn't need dialogue. Why Gen Zs are running away from dialogue is because the opposition want to hijack the protests and force the president into a corner to dialogue with the view of sharing power. People did not go to the streets so that Raila Odinga can sit with President Ruto and share power. People went to the streets because they felt that the government was giving them a raw deal. To me, we have not reached the position of dialogue. There is nothing to dialogue about. If we want roads done, some of these roads that have not been done were budgeted in 2-3 financial years ago. They have spent that budget, the roads remain untarmacked. Free and compulsory basic education. We do not have adequate funding. Money is budgeted, but money does not go to the schools to support this program. We have fertilizers. We also, that this year, farmers were treated to fake fertilizer. These are the things that the young children or Generation Z are raising to the head of state. To call them for dialogue now is premature because they have told you we are on the streets because your cabinet is ineffective. And then you dismiss the cabinet and recall 6 out of the dismissed cabinet secretaries. You lose national trust and national confidence. What else will you want this young generation to dialogue with you? And the president must also understand that Gen Z is basically holding brief for all the generations. Because what they are raising is what Gen X is raising, is what the so-called lost generation is raising, is what our ancestors raised and God took them before the matters were addressed. So they are holding brief. And there might come a time when all the generations may join Gen Zs in raising these genuine concerns. What the president and the security agencies must be concerned with is isolating crooks, isolating looters from genuine protesters. Because again, we have young people, we have old people who are taking advantage of the peaceful demonstrations to arm themselves, to destroy people's property, to loot and do everything bad in the name of Gen Zs. When the president calls them anarchists, I want to believe that he's referring to the looters. And as the chair of the National Security Council under the Constitution, he has every duty and obligation to ensure that the country is protected from looters and people with ill intent. So for Gen Zs, let them continue with the demonstrations. Yesterday, the president told them enough is enough. They have to leave the streets. And their response to the president is this: the president never called for any demonstrations and he cannot stop any demonstrations. Him is to watch, provide security, and ensure that protesters are protected, ensure that people's property is protected, and that criminals, looters are isolated, arrested, so that peaceful demonstrations can go on in the country.
Right. And lastly, let's talk matters the NCIC.
Yes.
We saw some of the comments that some of the legislatures have made, and some of the citizens and just Kenyans are feeling that the NCIC is almost cuddling these legislatures and real consequences are not being met for the hate speech that they have made. How do you feel about that?
NCIC, the National Commission on Integration Commission, is a toothless dog that bites but has no capacity of biting. Is an extension of government agencies. It is holding brief for the executive and it is used for political reasons. It only targets those legislators who are opposed in form and mind to the executive or to the government that is in power. But when those in power and in authority talk in support of what against, if the opposition talks against what the government is doing, NCIC will go for them. For instance, the Farah Malim, is it MP for Dadaab? He said that if he were president, all the protesters should be killed. You know, by now, Farah Malim ought to be in jail without bail, awaiting trial for making highly inflammatory statements. But because the statement was in support of the government of the day, they simply hosted him for tea. And then they asked him to go back. He has not faced the full force of the law. So that commission is one of the dead commissions, is one of the things that the president ought to reform, and is a commission that should work with objectivity. Without objectivity, it is a pure waste of public funds.